You feel overwhelmed by negative emotions that seem to multiply: daily anger at unfair treatment, anxiety about the future, frustration with circumstances beyond your control. Every setback triggers a cascade of destructive thoughts that poison your peace of mind and drain your energy. While you watch others maintain their composure under similar pressures, I am Marcus Aurelius, who maintained inner tranquility while ruling the most powerful empire in history and bearing the weight of millions of lives on my shoulders. The Stoic principles I developed through years of personal struggle and imperial responsibility will show you how to build an unshakable fortress of emotional mastery that no external circumstance can penetrate. What I learned about conquering the inner battlefield of emotions through plagues, wars, betrayals, and the crushing burden of absolute power will transform how you respond to life's inevitable challenges. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom that has guided emperors and philosophers for centuries, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to achieve true emotional freedom. Let me take you back to when I was just Marcus, a young man thrust into power I never sought, drowning in emotions I couldn't control. When Emperor Antoninus Pius adopted me, I thought philosophy would be my greatest challenge. I was wrong. The real test came when the weight of an empire settled on my shoulders, and every decision carried the burden of millions of lives. I remember the exact moment everything changed. I was 25, standing in the marble halls of the palace, when news arrived that Germanic tribes were massing on our borders. My first reaction wasn't strategic thinking, it was pure panic. My heart raced, my hands trembled, and my mind flooded with catastrophic thoughts. What if I failed? What if my inexperience led to Rome's destruction? What if I proved unworthy of the purple? That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the corridors, consumed by anxiety, anger at the situation, an overwhelming self-doubt. I felt like a fraud wearing the emperor's robes. But in that darkness, something profound occurred to me. I realized I was suffering twice, once from the actual challenge before me, and again from my emotional reaction to it. The barbarians at our gates were one problem. My terror about the barbarians was an entirely separate problem, and one I was creating myself. This revelation became the foundation of everything I would later write in my meditations. I understood that external circumstances, wars, plagues, political betrayals, were simply facts. They existed whether I was calm or panicked, confident or terrified. But my emotional response to these facts was entirely within my control, and, more importantly, it was what determined my effectiveness as a leader and my peace as a human being. I began experimenting with this idea when senators brought me impossible decisions. Instead of immediately reacting with frustration or anxiety, I would pause and separate the decision itself from my emotional response to it. When reports arrived of military defeats, rather than spiraling into despair, I would acknowledge the facts while maintaining control over my inner state. It wasn't easy. Emotional mastery is perhaps the most difficult skill any human can develop. My emperor, Lucius Verus, used to marvel at this transformation. He would often ask how I maintained such composure during our joint campaigns. I told him the secret. I had learned to treat my emotions like advisors, not commanders. They could provide information, but they could never be allowed to make decisions. The real test came during the Great Plague that devastated our empire. Every day brought news of death and suffering on an unimaginable scale. The old Marcus would have been consumed by grief, paralyzed by the magnitude of the catastrophe. But I had learned to channel that grief into action, to transform despair into determination. I couldn't control the plague, but I could control how I responded to it. This is when I truly understood that becoming emperor had been the universe's way of forcing me to develop the emotional strength I never knew I needed. Every crisis became a teacher, every setback a lesson in resilience. The burdens of rule, which initially seemed like curses, revealed themselves as the perfect training ground for mastering the human condition. By the time I was writing my private thoughts each evening, what you now know as my meditations, I had discovered something remarkable. The same principles that helped me govern an empire could help anyone govern their inner world. The techniques that maintained my sanity while bearing ultimate responsibility could maintain anyone's peace in the face of life's inevitable challenges. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It took years of daily practice, constant self-examination, and the humbling experience of failure after failure. But gradually, I built what I came to think of as an inner citadel, a fortress of peace that no external storm could penetrate. And that fortress, my friend, is what I'm going to teach you to build. Asterisk, asterisk, picture a fortress so strong that no army could breach its walls. No siege could starve its defenders. No storm could shake its foundation. This fortress exists within you. Right now, though you may not know it, I call it the inner citadel, and building it became my life's most important work. When I first conceived of this inner sanctuary, I was camped along the Danube River, surrounded by the chaos of war. Enemy fires burned on the horizon. My soldiers were dying of disease, and political enemies back in Rome were plotting against me. Yet sitting in my tent that night, writing by lamplight, I discovered something extraordinary. None of this external turmoil could touch the deepest part of my being unless I allowed it. The inner citadel is not a place of retreat or escape. It's a place of strength, the unassailable core of your consciousness, where you remain free regardless of what happens around you. I learned to access this fortress, not by withdrawing from the world, but by understanding my relationship to it. Here's the fundamental principle I discovered. You are not your circumstances, your emotions, or even your thoughts. You are the observer of all these things. When anger arises, you can watch it without becoming it. When fear strikes, you can notice it without being consumed by it. When others attack your reputation or your work, you can observe their actions without letting them define your worth. I practiced building this citadel every morning before dawn. While my camp slept, I would sit quietly and remind myself of this truth. My essential self, my ability to choose my response, to act with virtue, to maintain my values was completely independent of external events. A barbarian tribe might defeat my legions, but they could never defeat my character. A plague might ravage my empire, but it could never infect my commitment to justice and wisdom. The walls of your inner citadel are built from a simple but powerful recognition. There is always a gap between what happens to you and your response to what happens to you. In that gap lies your freedom. Most people live their entire lives without ever discovering this gap exists. They believe that external events automatically determine their internal states. Someone insults them, so they must feel angry. They face a setback, so they must feel despair. A plan fails, so they must feel defeated. But I learned that this automatic response is an illusion. You always have a choice in how you respond. Always. Even when that choice feels impossible to see. Even when emotions seem overwhelming. Even when circumstances appear to leave no options, the choice is there. Your inner citadel is built by repeatedly exercising this choice, by claiming the space between stimulus and response. Let me give you a practical example. During one particularly brutal campaign, I received word that my trusted general had been killed in an ambush. My first impulse was rage at the enemy, at the situation, at the unfairness of losing such a good man. But I had trained myself to pause in that space between the news and my response. I acknowledged the rage without being controlled by it. I felt the grief without being paralyzed by it. From that place of inner strength, I could honor my general's sacrifice by making wise decisions about our next moves, rather than emotional ones. This is how you build your own citadel. Start by recognizing when external events trigger automatic, emotional responses. Instead of immediately acting on those emotions, pause, create space. Remind yourself that you are the observer of these emotions, not their prisoner. Ask yourself, what response would serve me and others best right now? Then choose deliberately rather than react automatically. The beauty of the inner citadel is that once you build it, it becomes unshakable. Criticism cannot wound you because your worth doesn't depend on others' opinions. Failure cannot devastate you because your identity isn't tied to specific outcomes. Loss cannot destroy you because your peace comes from within, not from external possessions or relationships. This doesn't mean you become cold or indifferent. I loved my wife Faustina deeply, cared passionately about my empire's welfare, and grieved when good people died. But I loved, cared, and grieved from a place of strength. Rather than vulnerability, my inner citadel allowed me to engage fully with life while remaining emotionally free. Your inner citadel is waiting for you to build it. Every time you choose your response, rather than react automatically, you add another stone to its walls. Every time you remember that you are not your circumstances, you strengthen its foundation. Every time you act from your values rather than your emotions, you make it more impregnable. Build it consciously, daily, moment by moment. Soon you'll discover what I learned on those cold nights by the Danube. True freedom isn't the absence of challenges. It's the presence of an unshakable inner peace that no external force can touch. Asterisk, the most transformative discovery of my life came during the darkest period of my reign, when the Antonine Plague swept through our empire like the wrath of the gods. Death surrounded me daily. I watched entire families perish, saw my strongest soldiers reduced to corpses, and witnessed the collapse of communities I had sworn to protect. Any reasonable person would have called this an unmitigated catastrophe, but I learned something profound during those plague years. Reality is not what happens to you. Reality is how you perceive what happens to you. The plague was a fact, but my interpretation of the plague determined whether it became a source of despair or a catalyst for growth. This realization changed everything. I discovered that between every event and our emotional response lies our perception, our interpretation of what the event means. Most people never examine this interpretation. They assume their first emotional reaction represents truth. Someone criticizes their work, and they immediately feel hurt, believing the criticism means they're inadequate. They face a setback, and they automatically feel defeated, believing the setback means they're failures. But I trained myself to catch these interpretations before they solidified into emotional reactions. When plague reports arrived at my tent, each morning my mind's first impulse was to think, this is terrible. Everything is falling apart. I'm failing as an emperor. But I learned to pause and examine these thoughts. Were they facts or interpretations? Were they helpful or harmful? Were they based on truth or fear? I developed what I called the discipline of perception, the practice of stripping away emotional interpretations to see events as they actually are. The plague, viewed objectively, was simply a biological phenomenon affecting human bodies. It had no inherent meaning beyond that. The meaning I assigned to it, whether I saw it as divine punishment, personal failure, or natural occurrence, determined my emotional response and effectiveness as a leader. Let me teach you this discipline through a specific example. During one particularly devastating outbreak in Rome, I received reports that citizens were rioting, blaming me personally for their suffering. My initial perception was, they hate me, I'm a failure, my people have turned against me. These thoughts generated shame, anger, and despair, but I had trained myself to step back and examine my perceptions. Were these citizens rioting because they hated me personally, Or were they simply afraid, grieving, and looking for someone to blame? Was their anger really about my leadership, or was it about their terror of death? When I stripped away my emotional interpretation, I saw frightened people seeking comfort, not subjects rejecting their emperor. This shift in perception changed everything. Instead of responding defensively or retreating in shame, I went into the city streets myself. I spoke with the grieving, comforted the afraid, and organized more effective relief efforts. My reframed perception led to constructive action rather than destructive emotion. Here's how you can develop this same discipline. When something happens that triggers a strong emotional response, pause and ask yourself 3 questions. What actually happened here, stripped of all interpretation? What story am I telling myself about what this means? Is there another way to perceive this situation that would serve me better? Most of our suffering comes not from events themselves, but from our interpretations of events. Your coworker doesn't respond to your email immediately, and you interpret this as disrespect or rejection. Your project doesn't go as planned, and you interpret this as evidence of your incompetence. Your relationship hits a rough patch, and you interpret this as a sign of inevitable failure. But these interpretations are choices, not facts. You can learn to choose interpretations that empower rather than diminish you. Your coworker might be busy or might not have seen your email. Your project's unexpected direction might lead to better outcomes than you originally planned. Your relationship's challenges might be opportunities for deeper connection and growth. I'm not suggesting you deny reality or engage in positive thinking fantasies. When something genuinely harmful happens, acknowledge it clearly. But don't add unnecessary suffering by interpreting every challenge as a catastrophe, every setback as a failure, every criticism as an attack on your worth. During my campaigns against the Germanic tribes, we suffered several significant defeats. The old Marcus would have interpreted these as proof of his inadequacy as a military leader. But by then, I had learned to see defeats as information rather than identity. They told me what tactics weren't working, which strategies needed adjustment, which approaches required different resources. This perception allowed me to learn from losses rather than be defeated by them. The discipline of perception is perhaps the fastest way to reduce negative emotions. When you stop automatically accepting your first interpretation of events, you free yourself from most unnecessary suffering. When you learn to see challenges as training rather than punishment, obstacles as strengthening rather than weakening, and setbacks as redirection rather than failure, your emotional landscape transforms completely. Practice this discipline daily. When something upsets you, pause and examine your interpretation. Ask yourself, is this interpretation helping me or hurting me? What would a wise person see in this situation? How might this challenge actually serve my growth? You'll be amazed at how quickly your emotional responses change when you change your perceptions. Remember, you cannot always control what happens to you, but you can always control how you perceive what happens to you. Master your perceptions, and you master your emotional life. The single most important lesson I learned as emperor came not in the throne room or on the battlefield, but during a quiet moment in my private chambers. I was agonizing over a decision that could affect millions of lives, wrestling with fears about outcomes I couldn't guarantee, when a simple truth struck me with devastating clarity. I was torturing myself over things beyond my control while neglecting the one thing that was entirely within my power, my own choices and responses. This revelation led me to develop what became the cornerstone of my emotional philosophy, the dichotomy of control. Every aspect of human experience falls into one of 2 categories: what you can control and what you cannot control. Master this distinction, and you master your emotional life. Ignore it, and you condemn yourself to perpetual frustration and anxiety. Let me be absolutely clear about what you can control. You can control your thoughts, though it takes practice. You can control your responses to events, though it requires discipline. You can control your values, your effort, your preparation, and your character. You can control how you treat others, what you focus on, and how you interpret circumstances. These things and only these things are truly yours to command. Everything else lies outside your control. Other people's opinions, reactions, and decisions are beyond your influence. The weather, the economy, the past, and the future exist independent of your will. Whether others like you, respect you, or agree with you is not your concern. Whether your plans succeed exactly as intended is not your domain. Whether you live to see tomorrow is not your decision to make. When I first understood this principle, intellectually, I thought it was obvious. Of course, you can't control other people or external events, but applying this wisdom emotionally proved far more challenging. I discovered I was spending enormous mental energy trying to control the uncontrollable while neglecting my actual sphere of influence. During the Marcomannic Wars, I watched myself obsess over whether the Germanic tribes would accept our peace treaties. I worried about their intentions, their trustworthiness, their future actions. This worry accomplished nothing except to drain my energy and cloud my judgment. When I finally applied the dichotomy of control, I stopped trying to control their decisions and focused entirely on making our terms as fair and our position as strong as possible. I could control our preparation, our negotiation strategy, and our response to whatever they decided. Their actual decision was theirs to make. This shift eliminated my anxiety about the negotiations entirely. I wasn't indifferent to the outcome. I cared deeply about peace for our empire. But I had learned to care without attachment, to invest in the process without demanding specific results. This detachment actually made me more effective because I could think clearly rather than emotionally. Here's how you can apply this principle immediately. When you feel frustrated, anxious, or angry, ask yourself, what specifically am I trying to control here? Then divide your concerns into two lists, within my control and outside my control. Focus all your energy on the first list. Completely release the second list. Your teenager is making poor choices. You can control the conversations you have with them, the boundaries you set, and the example you model. You cannot control their decisions, their friends, or their attitude. Pour your energy into being the best parent you can be. Release your need to control their choices. Your co-worker is spreading rumors about you. You can control how you respond. Professionally, whether you address the situation directly and how you maintain your own integrity. You cannot control their behavior, others' opinions, or whether the rumors spread. Focus on being above reproach in your own conduct. Let go of managing others' perceptions. Your business is struggling in a difficult economy. You can control your effort, your strategy, your expenses, and your innovation. You cannot control market conditions, consumer behavior, or competitor actions. Channel all your energy into what you can influence. Stop wasting time lamenting what you cannot change. I discovered that most negative emotions stem from attempting to control the uncontrollable. Anxiety comes from trying to control future outcomes. Anger comes from trying to control others' behavior. Depression often comes from trying to control past events or their consequences. Resentment comes from trying to control others' opinions or treatment of us. But when you truly embrace the dichotomy of control, these emotions lose their power over you. You cannot feel anxious about things you've genuinely accepted as beyond your influence. You cannot feel angry at people whose behavior you've acknowledged as their choice, not your responsibility. You cannot feel depressed about circumstances you've recognized as outside your domain. This doesn't mean you become passive or indifferent. I cared passionately about my empire's welfare, my family's happiness, and my subjects' prosperity. but I cared from a position of strength rather than weakness. I invested my energy where it could make a difference rather than where it would be wasted. The practice requires constant vigilance because the mind naturally wants to control everything. When news arrived that a distant province was in rebellion, my first instinct was to worry about every possible consequence. But I had trained myself to immediately ask, what can I control about this situation? I could control how quickly we responded, which resources we deployed, and how we approached the rebels. Everything else was beyond my influence. Start practicing this principle today. Notice when you feel stressed or upset, then trace that emotion to its source. Almost always, you'll find you're trying to control something beyond your power. Redirect that energy toward what you actually can influence. Over time, this practice will transform your emotional life completely. Remember, you become truly powerful only when you stop trying to control what isn't yours to control and start mastering what is. Focus on your sphere of influence and watch your peace expand as your anxiety disappears. Asterisk, asterisk, every evening before sleep, I would perform a practice that my courtiers found morbid, but which became the source of my greatest peace. I would imagine losing everything I held dear. I would picture my wife Faustina dying, my children perishing in plague, my empire crumbling, my health failing, my reputation destroyed. This wasn't pessimism or self-torture, it was the most powerful emotional preparation I ever discovered. I call this practice negative visualization, and it may be the most counterintuitive wisdom I can share with you. While most people avoid thinking about loss and focus only on positive outcomes, I learned that regularly contemplating potential losses actually increases appreciation, reduces anxiety, and builds unshakable emotional resilience. The practice began during my early years as emperor when I lived in constant fear of losing what I had gained. Every good thing felt fragile, every blessing temporary. I was so afraid of loss that I couldn't fully enjoy what I possessed. I realized I was living as a slave to my attachments, constantly anxious about protecting what could be taken away at any moment. But then I discovered something remarkable. When I deliberately imagined losing these things, my relationship to them transformed completely. Instead of taking my wife's presence for granted, imagining her absence made me treasure every conversation we shared. Instead of feeling entitled to my health, contemplating illness made me grateful for every pain-free day. Instead of assuming my power was permanent, visualizing its loss made me use it more wisely. Let me share how this practice saved my sanity during the plague years. When the disease first reached Rome, I was terrified not of death itself, but of losing my loved ones. This fear paralyzed me, making me overprotective and anxious, but I had been practicing negative visualization for years, regularly imagining the deaths of those closest to me. When real death began striking around me, I was emotionally prepared in a way that surprised even myself. I had already grieved these potential losses in my imagination, which allowed me to be present with actual loss rather than being overwhelmed by it. When my adopted son, Lucius Verus, died, I felt genuine grief, but not devastating shock. I had prepared myself emotionally for this possibility, which allowed me to honor his memory while continuing to fulfill my duties. Here's how you can practice negative visualization safely and beneficially. Choose one area of your life where you feel attached or anxious: your job, your relationship, your health, your possessions. Spend a few minutes imagining losing this thing completely. Don't torture yourself with details, but clearly picture yourself without it. How would you cope? What would remain valuable in your life? What opportunities might even arise from this loss? The key is not to become pessimistic or fatalistic, but to reduce your emotional dependence on external things. When you've mentally rehearsed loss, you become less desperately attached to outcomes. This detachment paradoxically allows you to enjoy what you have more fully because you're not constantly worried about losing it. I practiced this technique with my empire regularly. I would imagine barbarian invasions succeeding, provinces declaring independence, the Senate deposing me. Far from making me a worse emperor, this practice made me better. I governed with less ego and more wisdom because I wasn't desperately trying to preserve my position. I made decisions based on what was right rather than what would protect my power. During military campaigns, I would visualize our armies being defeated, our strategies failing, our allies betraying us. This mental preparation allowed me to remain calm during actual setbacks because I had already considered these possibilities. When we did suffer defeats, I could respond strategically rather than emotionally because the outcomes weren't shocking. To me, the practice works because it accomplishes several things simultaneously. First, it reduces the shock value of negative events. Nothing can devastate you if you've already contemplated it as a possibility. Second, it increases gratitude for what you currently have. You cannot take something for granted when you regularly imagine its absence. Third, it builds confidence in your ability to handle loss. When you've mentally survived worst-case scenarios, you know you can handle whatever actually happens. Most people live in denial about the temporary nature of everything. They assume their health will continue, their relationships will last, their careers will progress smoothly. This denial makes them fragile because they're unprepared for the losses that inevitably come. Negative visualization is the antidote to this fragility. I remember one particularly powerful session when I imagined losing my ability to write something that had become essential to my peace of mind. I pictured my hands too weak to hold a stylus, my mind too clouded to form thoughts. Initially, this visualization filled me with dread, but as I sat with the image, I realized that even without writing, I could still think. Even without thinking clearly, I could still act with kindness. Even without any abilities at all, my essential self would remain intact. This realization freed me from desperate attachment to any particular capacity or possession. I could still prefer to keep my abilities, still work to maintain them, still feel disappointed if I lost them, but I was no longer enslaved by the fear of their loss. Practice negative visualization regularly, but gently. The goal is not to become morbid or anxious, but to build emotional resilience and appreciation. Start with small things. Imagine your car breaking down, your phone being lost, your favorite restaurant closing. Notice how the visualization affects your appreciation for these things when you have them. Gradually work up to bigger concerns. Imagine job loss, health problems, relationship difficulties. The point is not to invite these experiences, but to prepare yourself emotionally for life's inevitable uncertainties. When you've already mentally navigated loss, you become unshakable in the face of actual challenges. Remember, the goal is not to expect the worst, but to be prepared for anything while appreciating everything. Negative visualization builds the emotional muscle you need to remain strong no matter what life brings your way. Asterisk. The greatest revelation of my military career came not during a moment of victory, but in the depths of what appeared to be crushing defeat. We were trapped in the Carpathian Mountains, surrounded by Germanic tribes, running low on supplies, with winter approaching fast. My generals were demoralized, my soldiers were sick, and many of my advisors counseled retreat. But sitting in my tent that night, studying maps by flickering candlelight, I experienced an insight that would transform not just this campaign, but my entire approach to life's challenges. I realized that this obstacle, this seemingly impossible situation, was not working against me. It was working for me. Every difficulty we faced was actually strengthening us, teaching us, preparing us for something greater. The impediment to action, I understood, could become the path of action. What blocked the way could become the way. This principle, which I came to call the philosophy of obstacles, became the foundation of my approach to every challenge I would face as emperor. Instead of seeing difficulties as problems to be avoided, I learned to see them as opportunities to be embraced. Instead of resenting resistance, I learned to welcome it as the universe's way of building my strength. Let me explain how this works. Practically, when you encounter an obstacle, whether it's a difficult person, a setback in your career, a health challenge, or a relationship problem, natural reaction is probably frustration or discouragement. You want the obstacle removed so you can proceed with your original plan. But I learned to ask a different question. How is this obstacle trying to help me grow? During that mountain campaign, being trapped forced us to develop new tactics we never would have discovered otherwise. Limited supplies taught us efficiency we had never practiced. The harsh conditions bonded my troops in ways that easy victories never could. When we finally broke through the enemy lines, we were not the same army that had entered those mountains. We were stronger, more resourceful, more united. The obstacle had transformed us. This same principle applies to every area of your life. The difficult boss who challenges your patience is teaching you emotional self-control. The financial setback that forces you to budget is developing your discipline and creativity. The relationship conflict that requires difficult conversations is deepening your communication skills. The health scare that changes your lifestyle is redirecting you toward better choices. I practiced this philosophy throughout my reign, and it never failed to transform my experience of challenges. When the Senate opposed my policies, instead of feeling frustrated by their resistance, I used their objections to refine my thinking and build stronger arguments. When provinces rebelled against Roman rule, instead of simply crushing the rebellion, I examined what their grievances might teach us about governing more justly. The key insight is this: obstacles don't just test your current abilities, they force you to develop new ones. You never discover what you're truly capable of until circumstances demand more than you thought you could give. The pressure that feels overwhelming is actually the force that transforms carbon into diamonds. Here's how you can begin applying this philosophy immediately. The next time you face a significant challenge, instead of asking why is this happening to me, ask what is this trying to teach me. Instead of how can I get rid of this problem, ask how can I grow from this problem. Instead of this isn't fair, ask what opportunity is hidden in this difficulty. I remember when plague struck my personal household, affecting several of my children. My immediate reaction was grief and terror, the natural response of any father. But I had trained myself to look deeper. What was this tragedy asking of me? It was demanding that I practice the philosophy I preached, that I demonstrate Stoic principles under the ultimate test. It was teaching me about the preciousness of time, the importance of presence, the reality of impermanence. It was preparing me to lead others through their own grief with authentic understanding rather than theoretical knowledge. This doesn't mean you should welcome suffering or seek out difficulties. It means that when obstacles inevitably appear, you can choose to be strengthened by them rather than weakened. You can choose to see them as curriculum rather than punishment, as training rather than torture. The philosophy of obstacles also changes how you approach goals and ambitions. When your path forward gets blocked, instead of stopping or forcing your way through, you learn to use the obstacle itself as a stepping stone. The rejection from one job opens the door to a better opportunity. The failure of one relationship teaches you what you need for a healthier one. The collapse of one plan forces you to discover a superior strategy. During my campaigns along the Danube, we repeatedly faced situations where our preferred strategies were impossible. Rivers were too high to cross at the planned locations. Weather prevented movements we had scheduled. Enemy actions disrupted our carefully laid plans. Initially, I saw these as frustrations, but I learned to see them as intelligence. The universe was teaching us better approaches than our limited perspective had conceived. This shift in perception transforms your entire relationship with difficulty. Challenges stop feeling personal and start feeling purposeful. Setbacks stop feeling like failures and start feeling like redirections. Obstacles stop feeling like enemies and start feeling like teachers. The strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. The most beautiful pearls are formed around irritants. The most profound wisdom comes from the deepest struggles. Your obstacles are not random punishments, they are precisely what you need to become who you're meant to be. Practice seeing every difficulty as a gift, even when you can't immediately understand what it's teaching you. Trust that resistance is not trying to stop you, but to strengthen you. Believe that detours are not delays, but discoveries. When you truly embrace the philosophy of obstacles, you become unstoppable because every challenge becomes fuel for your growth rather than a barrier to your progress. The path through obstacles is not around them or under them or over them. The path through obstacles is through them, using their very resistance to build the strength you need for whatever lies ahead. Asterisk, asterisk, every morning before dawn, while my empire still slept and the world remained quiet, I would sit alone in my chamber and perform the practice that became my greatest defense against negative emotions: morning reflection. This wasn't prayer to the gods or idle meditation. It was a deliberate preparation of my mind for the challenges the day would inevitably bring. I discovered this practice during my first year as emperor, when I realized that my emotional state in the morning determined the quality of my entire day. If I began reactively rushing to address urgent matters, immediately responding to problems, jumping into decisions without preparation, I remained reactive all day long. But if I began intentionally setting my mind, reviewing my principles, preparing for difficulties, I could maintain emotional equilibrium no matter what arose. Here's exactly what I did each morning. I would rise before my servants, light a single oil lamp, and spend the first hour of consciousness preparing my inner state. I would remind myself of fundamental truths that were easy to forget in the heat of daily challenges, that I could control my responses but not outcomes, that difficulties were opportunities for growth, that other people's actions reflected their character, not mine, that this day might be my last and should be lived accordingly. I would also practice what I called premeditation, mentally rehearsing the likely challenges of the coming day and my preferred responses to them. If I knew I would be meeting with difficult senators, I would visualize maintaining my composure despite their hostility. If military reports were due that might contain bad news, I would prepare my mind to receive setbacks without losing perspective. If I faced a complex decision, I would review the principles that should guide my choice. This morning practice became my armor against the day's emotional assaults. When actual challenges arose, I had already considered my response. When people behaved badly, I had already reminded myself that their behavior reflected their understanding, not my worth. When plans failed, I had already prepared myself to see obstacles as opportunities. Let me share a specific example. During one particularly tense period with the Germanic tribes, I knew negotiations would be difficult and potentially explosive. That morning, I spent extra time reminding myself that I could not control their decisions, only my own responses. I visualized them rejecting our terms, walking out of negotiations, even declaring war. I prepared my mind to remain calm and strategic, regardless of their behavior. When the actual meeting occurred, and they did indeed reject our initial proposals with considerable hostility, I felt prepared rather than surprised. My morning reflection had inoculated me against emotional reaction. I could respond thoughtfully instead of defensively, which ultimately led to a better outcome than my unprepared self would have achieved. Here's how you can develop your own morning reflection practice. Begin each day with 15 to 30 minutes of intentional mental preparation. Start by reminding yourself of core truths. You control your responses. External events cannot directly harm your inner peace. Challenges are opportunities for growth, and your character is more important than your circumstances. Next, mentally rehearse the day ahead. What meetings do you have? What challenges might arise? What difficult people might you encounter? For each potential situation, visualize yourself responding with your best self, calm, thoughtful, principled. Don't try to control outcomes in your visualization, but prepare your responses. Finally, set intentions for the day. How do you want to show up? What kind of person do you want to be, regardless of what happens? What values will guide your decisions? What would success look like in terms of character rather than results? I found it helpful to have specific phrases or reminders ready for common situations. When facing criticism, I would remind myself, this person's opinion of me is not my concern. My conduct is. When dealing with setbacks, I would think, this obstacle is here to strengthen me, not defeat me. When others behaved poorly, I would remember, they are acting from their understanding. I will act from mine. The key is consistency. This practice only builds strength through repetition. I never missed my morning reflection. Even during military campaigns when we were marching before dawn, I would wake earlier if necessary, find a quiet spot away from the camp, and spend that crucial time preparing my mind. Over time, this practice began to reshape my default responses. Instead of my first reaction being emotional, my first reaction became philosophical. Instead of being caught off guard by difficulties, I began expecting them and responding skillfully. Instead of ending days feeling drained by other people's behavior, I began ending days satisfied with my own responses. The morning reflection also helped me maintain perspective on what truly mattered. In the quiet of dawn, away from the urgency and drama of imperial duties, I could remember that reputation was less important than character, than others' approval was less valuable than self-respect, that external success was less meaningful than inner peace. Start your morning reflection practice tomorrow. Don't wait for the perfect setup or the ideal amount of time. Begin with 10 minutes of intentional mental preparation. Remind yourself of what you can and cannot control. Visualize responding to challenges with your best self. Set intentions for how you want to show up, regardless of what the day brings. You'll be amazed at how this simple practice transforms your entire day. When you begin with strength and intention, you maintain strength and intention. When you prepare your mind, in the morning, your mind serves you all day long. This is the foundation of emotional mastery, not reacting to what happens, but preparing to respond wisely to whatever may come. Asterisk, asterisk, if morning reflection was my armor against the day's challenges, evening review was my academy for emotional mastery. Each night, after my duties were complete and the palace had quieted, I would examine my day with the precision of a military strategist analyzing a battle. What had triggered my emotions? Where had I responded wisely? Where had I reacted poorly? What could I learn from each encounter? This practice of evening examination became perhaps the most powerful tool for my emotional development. It transformed every mistake into a lesson, every success into a pattern to repeat, and every day into a step forward in my journey toward wisdom. I began this practice after a particularly difficult day, early in my reign when I had lost my temper with a senator who questioned my judgment. I spent that evening replaying the encounter, feeling ashamed of my reaction and frustrated with my lack of self-control. But then I realized this shame could become growth if I approached it systematically. Instead of just feeling bad about my response, I could study it, understand it, and prepare to handle similar situations better. Here's how I structured my evening review. I would sit quietly with a scroll and stylus, then methodically examine the day's emotional episodes. For each significant interaction or challenge, I would ask myself specific questions. What exactly triggered my emotional response? What thoughts preceded the emotion? How did I actually respond? How did I wish I had responded? What principle could guide me better next time? Let me share an example from my campaigns along the Danube. One evening, I was reviewing a day when our scouts had reported enemy movements that later proved false. I had initially felt anger at what seemed like incompetence, then anxiety about our intelligence gathering, then frustration at the time we had wasted repositioning troops. In my evening examination, I traced each emotion to its source. The anger came from my expectation that scouts should be perfect, an unreasonable standard that set me up for disappointment. The anxiety came from trying to control the reliability of information, something partially but not entirely within my power. The frustration came from seeing the repositioning as wasted effort rather than valuable training for our troops. This analysis helped me see how my interpretations, not the events themselves, had created my emotional turmoil. The next time we received uncertain intelligence, I was prepared to respond more philosophically. I could use the information appropriately while maintaining emotional equilibrium about its limitations. The evening review also helped me recognize patterns in my emotional reactions. I noticed that I was most likely to lose composure when I felt my competence was being questioned, when I was tired from long days, or when I tried to multitask during important conversations. Recognizing these patterns allowed me to prepare for them. When I knew I would be tired, I could be extra vigilant about my responses. When I sensed my competence being challenged, I could remind myself that others' opinions did not determine my worth. But this practice wasn't just about identifying mistakes, it was equally about recognizing successes. When I handled a difficult situation well, I would examine what had contributed to that success. Had I prepared my mind beforehand? Had I remembered a helpful principle? Had I paused before responding? Understanding my successes helped me repeat them. Here's how you can develop your own evening review practice. Before sleep each night, spend 10 to 15 minutes examining your emotional responses from the day. Don't judge yourself harshly. Approach this with the curiosity of a scientist studying an interesting phenomenon. You are simply gathering data about how your emotional system works. For each significant emotional reaction, ask yourself, what specifically triggered this feeling? What thoughts or interpretations preceded the emotion? How did the emotion influence my behavior? Was my response helpful or harmful? What would I prefer to do differently in a similar situation? What principle or reminder might help me respond better next time? Write down your observations, if possible. I found that putting insights into words made them more concrete and memorable. When I wrote, anger at senators' criticism came from my need for approval, not from any actual harm to the empire. That insight became a permanent part of my understanding. The evening review also helped me track my progress over time. I could see patterns in my growth. Situations that once derailed me emotionally began to have less power over me. Triggers that once guaranteed poor responses gradually became opportunities to practice wisdom. People who once consistently upset me started to seem more like teachers than tormentors. One of the most valuable aspects of this practice was learning to separate my emotional reactions from my identity. When I examined my anger or fear or sadness objectively, I began to see these emotions as temporary experiences rather than permanent aspects of who I was. I wasn't an angry person. I was a person who sometimes experienced anger. This distinction was liberating because it meant I could change my patterns without changing my fundamental nature. The practice also developed my capacity for honest self-assessment without destructive self-criticism. I learned to observe my mistakes with interest rather than shame, to see my emotional reactions as information rather than evidence of my inadequacy. This non-judgmental awareness was essential for growth because shame and self-attack actually prevent learning rather than promote it. Over time, the evening review began to influence my daily behavior. Knowing I would be examining my responses later made me more conscious of them in the moment. I began to catch myself in reactive patterns more quickly because I had studied those patterns so thoroughly. The practice created a feedback loop that accelerated my emotional development. Start your evening review practice tonight. Don't try to analyze everything. Begin with 1 or 2 significant emotional moments from your day. Approach them with curiosity rather than judgment. Look for patterns, insights, and opportunities for growth. Remember that every emotional reaction, whether skillful or unskillful, contains valuable information about how your mind works. Your goal is not to eliminate all emotional reactions. Emotions are natural and often helpful. Your goal is to understand your emotional patterns so well that you can choose your responses consciously rather than react unconsciously. The evening review transforms you from a victim of your emotions into a student of them, and ultimately, into their master. The greatest prison I ever inhabited was not built of stone or iron, but of wanting. Despite possessing more power, wealth, and privilege than any human in the known world, I spent my early years as emperor in constant dissatisfaction, always yearning for something different. Something more, something other than what was present. This chronic wanting poisoned every blessing and turned abundance into scarcity. Learning to master desire became one of my most crucial victories. I remember the exact moment this truth crystallized for me. I was standing in my private gardens, surrounded by marble statues that had cost more than most people would earn in their lifetimes, wearing robes woven with gold thread, having just finished a meal prepared by the finest cooks in the empire. Yet I felt empty, restless, unsatisfied. I was thinking about a military campaign that wasn't progressing as quickly as I wanted, a senator whose loyalty the first questioned, a decision I needed to make about succession that felt overwhelming. Standing there in paradise, I realized I was living in hell, not because of my circumstances, but because of my relationship to them. I had everything anyone could want, yet I was focused entirely on what I didn't have, or what wasn't going according to my preferences. My desires had become my tyrants, and no external satisfaction could free me from their demands. This led me to develop what I called the discipline of desire, the practice of finding contentment with what exists, rather than constantly seeking what's missing. This wasn't about lowering my standards or abandoning all ambition. It was about distinguishing between natural desires that serve life and manufactured desires that serve only to create perpetual dissatisfaction. The discipline begins with a fundamental recognition. You already have everything you need to be content right now. Not everything you want, but everything you need. The air you're breathing, the consciousness that allows you to experience this moment, the capacity to choose your response to whatever arises. These are gifts of immeasurable value that most people take completely for granted. I practiced this discipline daily by deliberately focusing on what was present rather than what was absent. Instead of lamenting that certain provinces were rebellious, I appreciated the provinces that were peaceful. Instead of worrying about senators who opposed me, I valued those who supported the empire's welfare. Instead of feeling frustrated by my physical limitations, I felt grateful for my health and strength. This wasn't naive optimism or denial of genuine problems. During the plague years, I didn't pretend that massive death and suffering were good things, but I could appreciate the courage of physicians who stayed to help, the resilience of communities that supported each other, and the clarity about what truly mattered that crisis often brings. I could find meaning and even beauty within tragedy without minimizing its reality. The practice transformed my relationship to imperial power itself. instead of constantly seeking more control, more territory, more influence. I began appreciating the opportunity to serve that I already possessed. Instead of measuring my success against idealized visions of what Rome could become, I started valuing the actual progress we were making. However incremental, here's how you can develop this same discipline. Begin each day by listing 3 things you currently have that you previously wanted. Perhaps it's your current job, your relationship, your home, your health. Remember what it felt like to want these things, then fully appreciate having them now. This practice reconnects you with the satisfaction that accomplishment actually brings before new desires overshadow it throughout the day. When you notice yourself wanting something different, a better commute, more money, different weather, other people's behavior, to change, pause and redirect your attention to something good about your current situation. This isn't about convincing yourself everything is perfect, but about maintaining balance between awareness of what could improve and appreciation for what's already working. I discovered that most desires fall into 3 categories: natural and necessary, like food when hungry; natural but not necessary, like luxurious food when adequate food is available; and neither natural nor necessary, like needing others to approve of your choices. The discipline of desire means satisfying the first category, moderating the second, and eliminating the third. The most liberating realization was that happiness comes not from getting what you want, but from wanting what you have. This doesn't mean becoming passive or losing all motivation for improvement. I continued working to strengthen Rome, protect my people, and fulfill my duties, but I did so from contentment rather than desperate need, from choice rather than compulsion. When you want what you have, several miraculous things happen. First, you become genuinely grateful, which is perhaps the most reliable path to happiness available to humans. Second, you stop being manipulated by external circumstances. Your contentment doesn't depend on things going your way. Third, you make better decisions because you're not driven by desperate needs or fears of loss. The discipline also protects you from what I call the arrival fallacy, the belief that you'll be satisfied once you reach some future goal. I had achieved the highest position any Roman could attain, yet I was still waiting to arrive at satisfaction. I realized that if becoming emperor hadn't satisfied my desires, nothing external ever would. Contentment had to be cultivated internally, or it would never exist. Practice voluntary simplicity regularly. Deliberately choose less when you could choose more. Eat simpler meals sometimes. Wear older clothes. Take less comfortable transportation. This isn't self-punishment, but training in satisfaction. When you can be content with less, you become unshakable when you have more. I also practiced gratitude for ordinary moments that usually pass unnoticed. The warmth of sunlight, the taste of water when thirsty, the relief of sitting after standing, the pleasure of quiet after noise. These simple satisfactions are available constantly, but only to those who have trained themselves to notice them. The ultimate goal of this discipline is freedom. Freedom from the tyranny of constantly wanting your life to be different than it is. When you master desire, you discover that you already live in paradise. It's the same paradise you inhabited before, but now you have eyes to see it. Remember, the most precious things you own are the things you'd pay anything to get back if you lost them. You already possess treasures beyond measure: your health, your relationships, your opportunities, your very existence. The discipline of desire teaches you to see this wealth clearly and appreciate it fully. Right now, exactly as things are. Asterisk, asterisk, the true test of character comes not when everything is going well, but when everything is going wrong. Anyone can act virtuously when surrounded by virtuous people, when plans succeed, when others treat them fairly. But wisdom reveals itself in how you respond when others behave badly, when circumstances turn against you, when doing the right thing costs you something precious. This is what I learned to call the discipline of action, choosing virtue regardless of what others choose. During my reign, I faced countless situations where the easy path diverged sharply from the right path. Senators who plotted against me, while smiling to my face. Generals who prioritized personal glory over strategic wisdom. Governors who exploited provinces for their own enrichment. In each case, I had to choose between responding in kind or maintaining my principles regardless of their behavior. I remember one particularly challenging situation when a trusted advisor was discovered selling military information to our enemies. My first impulse was rage. This man had endangered thousands of soldiers and violated every oath he had sworn. My counselors urged swift execution as an example to others. The crowd would have cheered his death. Justice seemed to demand his blood, but I had trained myself to pause between impulse and action, to consider not just what felt satisfying, but what was actually right. Yes, this man deserved punishment, but did he deserve death? Would executing him serve justice or merely satisfy my anger? What kind of leader did I want to be? One who responded to betrayal with vengeance, or one who responded even to betrayal with wisdom? I chose a middle path. The advisor was stripped of his position. His property was confiscated to compensate those he had harmed, and he was exiled from the empire. He lived, but he faced consequences. Justice was served without my becoming a killer driven by emotion. More importantly, I remained true to my principles even when those principles cost me the satisfaction of revenge. This is the essence of the discipline of action. Your behavior reflects your character, not others' behavior. When someone treats you poorly, you have a choice. You can respond in kind, lowering yourself to their level, or you can respond according to your values, maintaining your integrity regardless of their choices. The discipline requires understanding that you can only control your own actions, never the results of those actions. I could choose to govern justly, but I couldn't force my subjects to appreciate justice. I could choose to lead with wisdom, but I couldn't compel others to follow wisely. I could choose to act with virtue, but I couldn't guarantee that virtue would be rewarded. This separation between action and outcome was initially difficult for me to accept. Like most people, I wanted my good choices to produce good results automatically. When they didn't, I felt frustrated and sometimes questioned whether virtue was worth the effort. But I gradually learned that the value of right action lies in the action itself, not in its external consequences. Here's how you can practice this discipline in your daily life. When someone treats you unfairly, respond with fairness anyway. When others are dishonest, maintain your honesty. When people around you complain and criticize, choose to speak constructively. When others act from fear or anger, choose to act from wisdom and compassion. This doesn't mean being passive or allowing others to harm you without consequences. The discipline of action sometimes requires setting firm boundaries, making difficult decisions, or standing up to people who abuse their power. But it means choosing your responses based on your values rather than your emotions, on what's right rather than what feels satisfying in the moment. During the Germanic campaigns, I faced generals who questioned my strategies, sometimes publicly, undermining my authority. My instinct was to assert dominance, to punish dissent, to demand absolute obedience. But I had to ask myself, what response would actually serve our mission? Sometimes that meant having difficult conversations about respect and chain of command. Sometimes it meant listening to valid concerns and adjusting my approach. Sometimes it meant removing people from positions they couldn't handle effectively. The key was that my responses served the empire's welfare, not my ego's comfort. I acted from principle, not from the need to prove I was in charge. This approach actually strengthened my leadership because people trusted that my decisions were based on wisdom rather than insecurity. The discipline becomes especially powerful in your most intimate relationships. When your spouse criticizes you unfairly, You can choose to respond defensively or to listen for any valid concern beneath the harsh words. When your children test your boundaries, you can choose to react from frustration or to respond from patience and consistency. When friends disappoint you, you can choose to withdraw or to address the issue directly and compassionately. I found it helpful to have clear principles prepared before difficult situations arose. I knew that I valued justice over convenience, truth over popularity, long-term welfare over short-term satisfaction. When emotions ran high, these pre-established values guided my choices better than my momentary feelings ever could. The discipline also requires accepting that other people's actions are beyond your control. You cannot make others treat you fairly, speak honestly, or act wisely. You can only control how you treat them, how you speak to them, and how you act toward them. This limitation is actually liberating because it frees you from the impossible task of controlling other people's behavior. One of the most challenging aspects of this practice is maintaining virtue when it seems to be working against you. There were times when my commitment to justice made me appear weak to those who preferred harsh displays of power. There were times when my honesty cost me political advantages that deception might have secured. There were times when my mercy was interpreted as softness by those who respected only strength. But I learned that these apparent costs were actually investments in my character. Every time I chose virtue over convenience, I became stronger. Every time I acted from principle rather than emotion, I became wiser. Every time I maintained my integrity despite external pressure, I became more truly myself. The ultimate reward of the discipline of action is unshakable self-respect. When you know that your responses reflect your highest values rather than your lowest impulses, you can face any situation with confidence. When you know that your behavior serves your principles rather than your immediate desires, you can sleep peacefully regardless of how others have treated you. Practice this discipline starting today. Choose one area where you tend to respond reactively, perhaps dealing with difficult colleagues, managing conflict in relationships, or handling criticism. Commit to responding from your values rather than your emotions in that area. Notice how this changes not just the outcomes of your interactions, but more importantly, how it changes your experience of yourself. Remember, you cannot control what others do, but you can always control what you do. Make your actions worthy of the person you aspire to be, regardless of whether others make theirs worthy of the people they could be. Asterisk. The most important battle I ever fought was not against Germanic tribes or rebellious provinces, but against the voice in my own head. This internal commentary, constantly judging, comparing, worrying, planning, criticizing, had more power to disturb my peace than any external enemy ever could. Learning to master this inner voice, to choose which thoughts to accept and which to reject, became the foundation of my emotional freedom. I first became aware of this internal narrator during a particularly stressful period when multiple crises demanded my attention simultaneously. Plague was spreading through Rome, barbarians were pressing our northern borders, and the Senate was questioning my handling of both situations. I noticed that even when I was trying to focus on solutions, my mind was constantly generating commentary. This is too much for one person to handle. What if I make the wrong decision? People will blame me if this gets worse. I'm not qualified for this level of responsibility. These thoughts felt automatic and truthful, but I began to realize they were neither. They were simply mental habits, patterns of internal dialogue that I had never questioned or examined. More importantly, I discovered that I didn't have to believe every thought that arose in my consciousness. I could observe these thoughts, evaluate them, and choose whether to accept them as truth or dismiss them as unhelpful mental noise. This realization led me to develop what I called the discipline of assent, the practice of consciously choosing which thoughts to endorse and which to release. just as I wouldn't automatically believe every rumor that reached my court. I learned not to automatically believe every thought that arose in my mind. The practice begins with simple awareness. Most people are so identified with their thoughts that they never notice the difference between themselves and their mental commentary. They think I'm not good enough for this promotion and automatically believe it. They think she doesn't respect me and accept it as fact. They think this situation is hopeless and surrender to despair. But I learned to create space between myself and my thoughts by observing them as mental events rather than absolute truths. When the thought I'm failing as an emperor arose, instead of immediately accepting or rejecting it, I would examine it. Is this thought helpful? Is it based on facts or fears? Does believing this thought serve my ability to lead effectively? Often, I discovered that the most emotionally powerful thoughts were the least factually accurate. The thought everyone is losing confidence in. My leadership felt very convincing when I was tired or stressed. But when I examined the evidence, I could see that most of my advisors continued to support my decisions and that many policies were succeeding, despite current challenges. Here's how you can develop this same discipline. Throughout the day, notice the ongoing commentary in your mind. Don't try to stop it. That's impossible and unnecessary. Instead, practice observing it with curiosity rather than automatically believing it. When a particularly strong or emotionally charged thought arises, pause and ask yourself, is this thought accurate? Is it helpful? What would I tell a friend who shared this thought with me? I found it especially important to question thoughts that began with absolutes. I always mess this up. Nobody respects me. Nothing I do matters. This will never work. These extreme statements are almost always false and serve only to generate negative emotions. When I caught my mind making these sweeping generalizations, I would challenge them with more nuanced and accurate observations. The discipline also involves recognizing the difference between facts and interpretations. The Senate voted against my proposal is a fact. The Senate voted against my proposal because they don't trust my judgment is an interpretation. Facts are neutral and can be dealt with constructively. Interpretations often create unnecessary emotional suffering. During one particularly difficult military campaign, I noticed my mind constantly generating catastrophic predictions. We're going to lose this war. My soldiers will lose faith in me. Rome will be conquered because of my failures. These thoughts felt urgent and important, but when I examined them objectively, I could see they were simply anxious speculation about unpredictable future events. I learned to respond to these thoughts with what I called gentle skepticism. Instead of fighting them or believing them, I would acknowledge them and then redirect my attention to what I could actually control in the present moment. Thank you, mind, for that prediction. But right now, I'm going to focus on today's strategic decisions. The practice becomes especially powerful when applied to self-critical thoughts. Most people have a harsh internal critic that constantly judges their performance, appearance, decisions, and worth. This critic often sounds authoritative and convincing, but it's usually just a collection of fears and insecurities disguised as helpful. Feedback. When thoughts like "I'm not smart enough for this responsibility" or "I always disappoint people" arose in my mind, I learned to treat them as I would treat an advisor who consistently gave bad counsel. I would listen briefly, consider whether there was any useful information, then dismiss the thought if it wasn't constructive. I also discovered that many negative thoughts were actually attempts by my mind to protect me from imagined future pain. The thought "this plan will probably fail" felt like realistic preparation, but it was often just my mind trying to avoid the disappointment of hoping for success. The thought "she probably doesn't like me" felt like social awareness, but it was usually just my mind trying to avoid the vulnerability of caring about someone's opinion. Understanding these protective mechanisms helped me respond to negative thoughts with compassion rather than resistance. I could acknowledge my mind's attempt to keep me safe, while still choosing more helpful and accurate thoughts. The ultimate goal of this discipline is not to eliminate all negative thoughts, neither possible nor desirable. Negative thoughts sometimes contain important information or motivate necessary action. The goal is to become the conscious curator of your mental life, rather than the passive victim of whatever thoughts happen to arise. With practice, you'll develop what I came to think of as mental sovereignty, the ability to choose your thoughts rather than be chosen by them. You'll still experience the full range of human thoughts and emotions, but you'll no longer be controlled by them. You'll become the ruler of your inner kingdom rather than its slave. Start practicing this discipline today. Notice the ongoing commentary in your mind without judging it or trying to change it. When particularly strong thoughts arise, pause and evaluate them objectively. Ask yourself whether believing these thoughts serves your well-being and effectiveness. Choose to endorse thoughts that help you flourish and gently release thoughts that hold you back. Remember, you are not your thoughts. You are the consciousness that observes thoughts. This distinction is the key to inner freedom and emotional mastery. One of my most profound realizations as emperor came not from studying philosophy or commanding armies, but from observing a simple incident in my palace gardens. A servant had accidentally dropped and broken an expensive vase, and I watched the various reactions. Other servants rushed to help clean up. Guards looked on with indifference. Visiting nobles whispered criticisms, and the servant himself showed obvious distress and shame. In that moment, I saw something that changed my understanding of human nature forever. Despite our different roles, social positions, and reactions, we were all connected by our shared humanity. The servant's embarrassment reminded me of my own moments of failure. The helper's compassion reflected the same kindness I had received. During my struggles, even the critic's judgment came from the same human tendency to feel superior when others stumble, a tendency I recognized in myself. This insight led me to embrace what the philosophers call sympatheia, recognition, that all humans are interconnected parts of a larger whole, like organs in a single body. When you truly understand this connection, it becomes impossible to feel genuinely alone or to see others as fundamentally different from yourself. More importantly, it transforms how you respond to difficult people and situations. The practice of sympatheia begins with recognizing that every person you encounter, no matter how different they appear on the surface, shares your fundamental nature. They want to be happy and avoid suffering, just as you do. They act based on their understanding of what will serve them, just as you do. When they behave badly, it's usually because they believe, mistakenly, that their harmful actions will somehow benefit them or protect them from pain. This understanding completely changed how I dealt with opposition and conflict during my reign. When senators criticized my policies, instead of taking their criticism personally, I could see that they were acting from their own concerns about Rome's welfare, their own political fears, or their own limited perspectives. When enemies attacked our borders, instead of viewing them as inherently evil, I could recognize that they were responding to their own pressures over population, famine, pressure from other tribes. This didn't make me passive or naive. I still defended Rome vigorously and made difficult decisions when necessary, but I could do so without hatred, without taking conflicts personally, and often with greater strategic wisdom because I understood my opponents' motivations rather than simply condemning them. Here's how you can begin practicing sympatheia in your daily life. When someone behaves in a way that frustrates or angers you, pause and ask yourself, what might they be afraid of? What might they be trying to protect? What pain or pressure might be driving this behavior? This doesn't excuse harmful actions, but it helps you respond from understanding rather than pure reaction. I remember dealing with a provincial governor who was consistently harsh in his treatment of local populations. My initial response was anger at his cruelty and a desire to punish him severely. But when I practiced sympathia, I realized that this man was probably acting from fear of appearing weak, fear of losing control, fear of rebellion. His harshness was his mistaken attempt to create security through intimidation. This understanding allowed me to address the real problem more effectively. Instead of simply removing him, which would have taught him nothing and helped no one, I reassigned him to a role better suited to his temperament and provided him with training in more effective governance. The provinces benefited from better leadership, and he learned skills that served him better than fear-based tactics. The practice becomes especially powerful in your closest relationships. When your spouse snaps at you after a difficult day, sympathia helps you see their stress rather than just their words. When your children act out, you can recognize their developmental struggles or unmet needs rather than taking their behavior as personal disrespect. When friends disappoint you, you can understand their limitations and pressures rather than simply feeling betrayed. I found sympathia particularly helpful during the plague years, when fear and suffering brought out both the best and worst in people. Some citizens hoarded resources while others shared generously. Some fled the city while others stayed to help. Some blamed foreigners while others showed compassion to all who suffered. Instead of judging these different responses, I could see them all as natural human reactions to terror and uncertainty. Understanding this allowed me to respond more effectively to each type of behavior. For those who hoarded, I could implement policies that addressed their security fears while ensuring fair distribution. For those who fled, I could accept their choice without resentment while focusing on supporting those who remained. For those who sought scapegoats, I could address their need to feel some control over an uncontrollable situation while redirecting their energy toward constructive action. The practice also protects you from one of the most common sources of emotional suffering, taking others' behavior personally. When you understand that people's actions primarily reflect their inner state rather than their assessment of you, criticism becomes less wounding, rejection becomes less devastating, and conflict becomes less threatening. During my military campaigns, enemy tribes would sometimes send insulting messages designed to provoke emotional responses that might lead to tactical mistakes. Before I understood sympathia, these insults would anger me and cloud my judgment. But once I recognized that these messages reflected their strategy and desperation rather than any truth about my character, they lost their power to disturb my peace. Sympathia even changes how you relate to your own difficult emotions. When anger, fear, or sadness arises, instead of fighting these feelings or judging yourself for having them, you can recognize them as natural human responses that connect you to everyone who has ever felt similarly. Your struggles become less isolating when you remember that they are part of the universal human experience. I practiced this during my own moments of doubt and despair, when the weight of imperial responsibility felt overwhelming. Instead of criticizing myself for feeling inadequate, I would remember that every leader throughout history had faced similar challenges and similar doubts. This connection to the broader human experience made my struggles feel less personal and more manageable. The deepest level of sympathia involves recognizing that even those who harm others are acting from some form of inner pain or confusion. This doesn't excuse their actions or eliminate the need for appropriate consequences, but it prevents the additional suffering that comes from hatred and the desire for revenge. When I had to deal with corruption, betrayal, or cruelty within my administration, I could see that these behaviors typically came from fear, greed, or ignorance, rather than pure malice. This understanding allowed me to address the problems without becoming consumed by anger or hatred emotions that would have harmed me more than they would have harmed the wrongdoers. Here's a practical exercise for developing sympathia. When you encounter someone whose behavior troubles you, Silently repeat this phrase. This person is suffering in some way, and their behavior is their attempt to reduce that suffering. This doesn't mean you have to agree with their methods or tolerate harmful behavior, but it helps you respond from compassion rather than condemnation. The ultimate gift of sympathia is the end of loneliness. When you truly understand your connection to all other humans, you can never feel completely isolated. Every person you meet becomes a reflection of aspects of yourself. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to practice understanding and compassion. Every conflict becomes a chance to bridge differences rather than deepen divisions. This practice doesn't make you weak or naive. It makes you stronger and wiser. When you can see others clearly, including their fears and motivations, you can respond more effectively to whatever situations arise. When you're not consumed by personal offense or emotional reactivity, you have more energy available for constructive action. Sympathia is perhaps the fastest way to reduce negative emotions toward others. It's hard to maintain anger toward someone when you genuinely understand their pain. It's difficult to feel superior to someone when you recognize your shared humanity. It's almost impossible to hate someone when you see them as a fellow traveler on the difficult journey of human existence. Practice this recognition daily, starting with the people closest to you and gradually extending it to strangers, difficult people, and even those you consider enemies. Remember that everyone you encounter is doing their best based on their current understanding, just as you are. This perspective transforms every interaction from a potential conflict into an opportunity for connection and growth. Every morning when I awoke in my imperial chambers, before attending to the affairs of state, I would perform a practice that my courtiers found morbid, but which I considered essential to wisdom. I would contemplate my own death, not with fear or dread, but with the same careful attention I gave to military strategy or philosophical study. This practice, memento mori, remember you must die, became one of my most powerful tools for maintaining perspective and emotional equilibrium. I began this practice after witnessing the sudden death of a young centurion during our Germanic campaigns. One moment he was joking with his fellow soldiers, vibrant and confident about his future plans. The next moment, an enemy arrow had ended his life forever. Standing over his body, I was struck not just by grief for a good man lost, but by the stark realization that my own death was equally certain and equally unpredictable. This wasn't a new intellectual concept for me. Every philosopher understands that death is universal, but seeing death's sudden arrival for someone so young and vital made its reality penetrate beyond my mind into my bones. I realized I had been living as if death were a distant theoretical possibility rather than an immediate practical certainty. That night, I began what became a daily practice of contemplating my mortality. I would imagine my last breath, my final thoughts, my body returning to the earth. I would consider what would matter to me in those final moments and what would seem utterly trivial. This wasn't self-torture, but self-education. Death became my teacher in how to live. The practice transformed my relationship to petty annoyances and daily frustrations. When senators spent hours debating trivial procedural matters, instead of feeling impatient, I would remember that both they and I had limited time remaining, and that this frustration would seem meaningless from the perspective of my deathbed. When courtiers engaged in palace gossip and political maneuvering, instead of being drawn into their dramas, I could see these concerns as the temporary distractions they truly were. Death awareness also clarified my priorities with stunning precision. Activities that seemed important when I assumed unlimited time revealed themselves as wasteful when viewed through mortality's lens. Grudges I had been nursing seemed petty when I considered that either the other person or I might die before reconciliation became possible. Projects I had been postponing seemed urgent when I realized that someday, perhaps soon, I would no longer have the opportunity to complete them. Here's how you can begin practicing memento mori in your own life. Each morning, spend a few minutes honestly acknowledging that this day might be your last. Not with anxiety or morbidity, but with clarity about what that possibility means for how you want to spend these hours. Ask yourself, if I knew I would die tonight, what would I want to accomplish today? How would I treat the people I encounter? What would I want my final actions to represent? This practice doesn't lead to reckless living or abandonment of long-term planning. Instead, it brings urgency to what truly matters and patience with what doesn't. When I remembered that my reign would inevitably end, I became more focused on creating lasting improvements rather than temporary victories. When I recalled that my time with loved ones was finite, I became more present during our interactions rather than distracted by other concerns. Death contemplation also provides the ultimate perspective on failure and success. From the viewpoint of mortality, most of our victories and defeats appear equally transient. The promotion you didn't get, the criticism you received, the mistake you made, none of these will matter when you're taking your final breath. This isn't nihilistic, it's liberating. It frees you to act from your values rather than your ego, to take meaningful risks rather than protecting meaningless positions. During the plague years, when death surrounded me daily, this practice became my anchor to sanity. While others were consumed by fear of dying, I had already made peace with mortality's inevitability. This didn't make me indifferent to the suffering around me, quite the opposite. Because I understood how precious and brief life was, I was motivated to reduce suffering wherever possible and to help others find meaning in their remaining time. The practice also teaches humility in the face of power and success. No matter how much authority I wielded as emperor, death would eventually strip it all away. No matter how many victories I achieved, mortality would render them historical footnotes. This knowledge prevented me from becoming intoxicated by power or defining my worth by external accomplishments. I found it particularly helpful to contemplate the deaths of great figures from history. Alexander the Great, despite conquering most of the known world, died young and left his empire to fragment. Julius Caesar, despite his military genius and political skill, was assassinated in the Senate. Even the gods of mythology, if they existed, seemed subject to fate and change. No achievement, no matter how impressive, grants immunity from mortality. But memento mori isn't meant to make you feel hopeless or insignificant. Instead, it's meant to help you focus on what can outlast your physical existence. The love you give, the wisdom you share, the positive changes you create, the example you set. When you remember that your time is limited, you naturally want to spend it on things that matter beyond your personal survival. The practice transforms your relationship to present moment experiences. When you're fully aware that you won't have infinite opportunities to watch a sunset, taste your favorite food, or laugh with friends, you pay attention more completely. Everything becomes more vivid when viewed through the lens of impermanence. I also used death contemplation to prepare for the actual process of dying. By regularly imagining my final moments, I became familiar with the idea rather than terrified by it. I could consider what kind of death would reflect the values I had tried to live by. This preparation brought peace rather than anxiety, because I knew I was training for the one experience that every human must face. Start incorporating memento mori into your daily routine. Each evening, reflect on the day as if it might have been your last. Each morning, consider the day ahead as if it might be your final one. Notice how this awareness changes your priorities, your patience, your presence, and your perspective. Remember, death is not the opposite of life, it's the teacher that shows you how to live. When you befriend mortality, you discover what immortality really means. the lasting impact of a life lived with purpose, courage, and love. Asterisk, asterisk, perhaps the most radical shift in my understanding came when I stopped trying to eliminate negative emotions and started learning to use them as allies. For years, I had approached anger, fear, sadness, and frustration as enemies to be conquered, weaknesses to be overcome, or failures of my philosophical practice. But through careful observation and experience, I discovered that these emotions, when properly understood, could become some of my most valuable teachers and tools. This revelation came during a particularly dark period, when news reached me that several provinces were simultaneously in rebellion. The plague was spreading faster than our medical knowledge could address, and key allies were questioning my leadership. I felt overwhelmed by a mixture of fear, anger, and despair that seemed to contradict everything I had learned about Stoic philosophy. I was angry at myself for feeling angry, afraid of my fear, and despairing about my despair. But then I realized I was fighting the wrong battle. Instead of struggling against these emotions, I began studying them with the same curiosity I brought to military strategy or philosophical problems. What were these feelings trying to tell me? What information were they providing? How might they actually serve my effectiveness as a leader if I learned to interpret them correctly? Anger, I discovered, was often a signal that something important to me was being threatened or violated. Instead of dismissing my anger at corrupt officials as unphilosophical, I learned to listen to what it was telling me about injustice that needed to be addressed. Instead of suppressing my fury at military incompetence, I used it as motivation to improve our training and strategy. Anger became my inner alarm system, alerting me to problems that required action. Fear revealed itself as my early warning system about potential dangers when I felt anxious about barbarian movements along our borders. Instead of dismissing this as weakness, I learned to investigate whether my concerns had merit. Often, my anxiety was picking up on subtle signals that my conscious mind had missed. Fear became a valuable source of information about risks that needed assessment and preparation. Even sadness and grief served important functions. When I felt profound sorrow about the deaths caused by plague, this emotion connected me to my humanity and motivated me to find better solutions. When I grieved the loss of good soldiers in battle, this sadness honored their sacrifice and reminded me of the weight of decisions that affected other people's lives. Grief became my compass for what mattered most deeply. Here's how you can begin transforming your relationship with negative emotions. Instead of immediately trying to get rid of uncomfortable feelings, pause and ask them what they're trying to tell you. Anger often points to violated values or boundaries that need attention. Fear frequently highlights genuine risks that deserve consideration. Sadness usually indicates loss of something valuable that deserves to be mourned. Frustration commonly signals that your current approach isn't working and needs adjustment. The key is learning to feel the emotion without being controlled by it. When anger arises, you can acknowledge its message about injustice while choosing how to respond constructively rather than reactively. When fear appears, you can gather the information it provides about potential dangers while making decisions from wisdom rather than panic. When sadness emerges, you can honor what you've lost while remaining open to what remains possible. I practiced this approach during negotiations with enemy tribes. When their demands made me angry, instead of letting that anger drive me toward hasty rejection or military action, I would examine what the anger was telling me. Often, it was pointing to proposals that would genuinely harm Roman interests. Valuable information that helped me craft counter-proposals that protected our needs while addressing their legitimate concerns. During the plague crisis, my fear about the disease's spread initially felt like a weakness that undermined my authority as a leader. But when I learned to listen to this fear, it motivated me to implement more aggressive containment measures. seek advice from the best physicians available, and communicate more transparently with the public about the challenges we faced. Fear became a driver of more effective leadership rather than a hindrance to it. The approach also works with more subtle emotional states. Frustration with slow progress on important projects taught me to examine whether my expectations were realistic, or whether our methods needed improvement. Disappointment with people's behavior helped me recognize where I was expecting others to act according to my values, rather than their own understanding. Even emotions I initially judged as entirely negative contained useful guidance when I learned to decode their messages. This doesn't mean indulging in emotional reactions or using feelings as excuses for poor behavior. The goal is to extract the information emotions provide while maintaining conscious choice about how you respond to that information. You can feel angry about injustice while responding with strategic action rather than vengeful reaction. You can experience fear about genuine dangers while acting from courage rather than paralysis. I found it helpful to develop a kind of emotional vocabulary that distinguished between the feeling itself and the action it might inspire. Anger about corruption could lead to either destructive rage or constructive reform. Fear about military threats could result in either panicked overreaction or wise preparation. The emotion provided the motivation. Wisdom determined the response. The practice also revealed how often I had been creating unnecessary suffering by judging my emotions rather than learning from them. When I stopped criticizing myself for feeling afraid during dangerous situations, I could focus entirely on addressing the actual dangers. When I stopped being ashamed of feeling sad about losses, I could move through grief more quickly and completely. One of the most powerful discoveries was that emotions often pointed to solutions as well as problems. Anger about inefficient administration motivated me to streamline bureaucratic processes. Fear about succession planning inspired me to develop better training for future leaders. Sadness about social inequality drove me to implement more just policies. Negative emotions became the fuel for positive changes. The ultimate goal is what I came to call emotional alchemy, the ability to transform the raw material of any feeling into useful action. This doesn't eliminate the experience of negative emotions, but it ensures that no emotional experience is wasted. Every feeling becomes an opportunity for learning, growth, or constructive response. Practice this emotional alchemy in your daily life. When uncomfortable emotions arise, resist the urge to immediately escape or suppress them. Instead, ask, what is this feeling trying to teach me? What action might it be motivating? How can I honor its message while choosing my response wisely? You'll discover that your emotions are not obstacles to overcome, but allies offering valuable guidance for navigating life's complexities. Remember, the goal is not to become emotionless, but to become emotionally intelligent. Your feelings are not your enemies. They are messengers carrying important information about your values, your needs, and your circumstances. Learn their language, and they will serve you faithfully throughout your journey toward wisdom and peace. One of the most challenging aspects of maintaining emotional equilibrium, as Emperor was learning to navigate other people's emotional storms without being swept away by them. Whether facing a panicked crowd during the plague, angry senators questioning my policies, or grieving families who had lost loved ones in war, I constantly encountered situations where others' intense emotions threatened to overwhelm my own carefully cultivated peace. I initially believed that mastering my own emotions would be sufficient for effective leadership, but I quickly discovered that leadership requires the ability to remain centered while others around you lose their composure. You must be able to think clearly when everyone else is panicking, respond wisely when others are reacting emotionally, and maintain your values when others are abandoning theirs. The breakthrough came when I realized that other people's emotions, like my own, were information rather than commands. When a senator spoke to me with obvious anger about a policy decision, His anger told me about his concerns, his fears, or his political pressures. It didn't require me to become angry in response. When citizens expressed fear about barbarian threats, their fear informed me about their need for security and reassurance. It didn't obligate me to share their panic. This distinction between receiving emotional information and absorbing emotional states became crucial for my effectiveness as a leader. I could acknowledge others' feelings, respond to their underlying needs, and make decisions that addressed their concerns without taking on their emotional turmoil as my own. Here's how I learned to practice what I call compassionate detachment in dealing with others' emotions. When someone approached me in an intense emotional state, I would focus first on remaining grounded in my own center. I would remind myself that their emotion was about their experience, not mine. I could care about their distress without being distressed myself. I could take their concerns seriously without taking their panic seriously. During one particularly challenging period, a delegation of merchants came to petition me about economic disruptions caused by the plague. They were clearly terrified about their financial survival, angry about perceived government inaction, and desperate for immediate solutions. My initial impulse was to either become defensive about their criticism or to absorb their anxiety and promise quick fixes I couldn't deliver. Instead, I practiced listening to their emotions without matching them. I could hear their fear without becoming afraid. I could acknowledge their anger without becoming angry. I could recognize their desperation without becoming desperate. From this place of centered calm, I could actually address their real needs. Information about government plans, realistic timelines for economic recovery, and specific actions they could take to protect their businesses. The key insight was that my emotional stability actually served others better than emotional sympathy would have. If I had matched their panic, we would have had a room full of panicked people with no one thinking clearly. By maintaining my equilibrium, I could provide the steady leadership they actually needed, even if it wasn't the emotional mirroring they initially expected. This approach works in all relationships, not just formal leadership situations. When your spouse comes home frustrated from work, you can acknowledge their frustration and offer support without taking on their stress as your own. When your children are upset about disappointments, you can comfort them and help them process their feelings without becoming equally upset. When friends share their anxieties, you can be present for their concerns without absorbing their worry. I developed several practical techniques for maintaining this balance. First, I learned to consciously breathe and ground myself when entering emotionally charged situations. Before responding to others' emotions, I would take a moment to center myself and remember my own values and perspective. Second, I practiced distinguishing between empathy and emotional contagion. Empathy means understanding and caring about others' feelings. Emotional contagion means automatically taking on others' emotional states. The first is helpful. The second is often destructive to both parties. Third, I learned to respond to the person behind the emotion rather than to the emotion itself. When someone was angry, I would address their underlying concerns rather than their anger. When someone was afraid, I would focus on their need for security rather than their fear. When someone was sad, I would honor their loss rather than trying to fix their sadness. During military campaigns, this skill became essential for effective command. Soldiers would sometimes approach me with intense fear about upcoming battles, anger about casualties from previous engagements, or despair about the duration of campaigns. If I had absorbed these emotions, I would have been paralyzed by the accumulated anxiety, rage, and hopelessness of an entire army. Instead, I learned to receive their emotions as valuable information about morale, concerns that needed addressing, and support that troops required. I could validate their feelings while maintaining the clear thinking necessary for strategic decisions. This approach actually increased their confidence in my leadership. because they knew I would remain steady regardless of circumstances. The practice also taught me about the difference between supporting others and rescuing them. When people shared emotional difficulties with me, my initial impulse was often to try to fix their problems or eliminate their distress. But I learned that this impulse, while well-intentioned, often prevented people from developing their own emotional resilience. Instead of trying to rescue others from their emotions, I learned to support them through their emotions. I could listen without trying to solve. I could comfort without taking responsibility for their feelings. I could offer guidance without becoming invested in whether they followed it. This approach was more helpful to them and less draining for me. Here's how you can develop these skills. In your own relationships, when someone shares intense emotions with you, pause before responding and check your own emotional state. Are you remaining centered, or are you absorbing their energy? Can you care about their experience without taking it on as your own? Are you responding to their underlying needs or just reacting to their emotional expression? Practice setting loving boundaries around others' emotional states. You can be fully present for someone's pain without making their pain your pain. You can offer support without sacrificing your own peace. You can maintain compassion without losing your perspective. I also learned the importance of not taking others' emotions personally, even when they seemed directed at me. When senators criticized my policies with obvious anger, their emotion was usually about their own fears, ambitions, or pressures rather than about my actual performance. When citizens expressed frustration with government decisions, their feelings often reflected their difficult circumstances rather than my failings as a leader. This understanding prevented me from becoming defensive or reactive when others' emotions seemed to target me personally. I could listen to legitimate concerns while recognizing that intense emotions often said more about the speaker's inner state than about the subject they were discussing. The ultimate goal is to become what I think of as an emotional lighthouse, someone who provides steady guidance and support without being shaken by the storms around them. This doesn't mean being cold or indifferent. It means being so grounded in your own peace that you can offer genuine help to others without losing your stability. Master this skill, and you'll discover that your relationships become deeper and more satisfying. People will seek your counsel because they know you won't be overwhelmed by their problems. You'll be more effective in challenging situations because you'll maintain clarity when others lose perspective. Most importantly, you'll be able to offer authentic support to others while protecting your own emotional well-being. After years of developing these practices individually, the real transformation came when I learned to integrate them into a seamless way of living. The morning reflections, evening reviews, discipline of perception, control of desires, and all the other techniques I had studied were not meant to be separate exercises, but parts of a unified approach to life. The goal was not to practice philosophy for an hour each day, but to live philosophically every hour of every day. This integration happened gradually, almost without my noticing. I began to find that the principles I had been consciously applying in formal practice were becoming my natural responses to situations. When criticism arose, I automatically examined my perceptions rather than reacting emotionally. When plans failed, I instinctively looked for the growth opportunity rather than dwelling on disappointment. When others behaved badly, I naturally considered their motivations rather than taking their actions personally. The key was moving from conscious technique to unconscious habit, from effortful practice to effortless response. But this transition required patience and persistence. Just as a soldier must drill basic movements until they become automatic in battle, I had to practice these philosophical responses until they became my default way of engaging with life. Let me share how this looked in practice during a typical day as emperor. I would wake before dawn and spend the first hour in morning reflection, setting my intentions and preparing my mind for whatever challenges might arise. This wasn't separate from my imperial duties. It was the foundation that made those duties manageable and meaningful. Throughout the day, I would apply the principles moment by moment. When receiving reports about provincial troubles, I would practice the dichotomy of control, focusing on what actions I could take rather than worrying about outcomes I couldn't guarantee. When meeting with difficult senators, I would use the discipline of perception to see their motivations clearly rather than interpreting their opposition as personal attacks. During meals, I would practice gratitude and present moment awareness, appreciating simple pleasures without taking them for granted. When making decisions, I would consider how they aligned with virtue rather than just with immediate political advantage. When conflicts arose, I would remember sympathia and try to understand all parties' perspectives before choosing my response. The evening review tied everything together, allowing me to learn from each day's experiences and prepare for better responses in the future. This wasn't just intellectual analysis, but practical training for wisdom. Each day became a laboratory for developing greater moral mastery and philosophical understanding. Here's how you can begin this integration process in your own life. Start by choosing one or two of the practices that resonate most strongly with you. Don't try to implement everything at once. This leads to overwhelm and abandonment of the entire project. Instead, focus on deeply integrating a few techniques until they become natural responses. For example, you might begin with morning reflection and the dichotomy of control. Spend a few weeks making these practices so consistent that you automatically begin each day with intentional preparation and naturally ask, what can I control here? When challenges arise, only after these responses become habitual should you add additional practices. The integration process requires what I came to call philosophical vigilance, the ongoing awareness of how you're responding to life's situations, and whether those responses align with your highest values. This isn't exhausting self-monitoring, but gentle, curious attention to your inner state and outward behavior. I found it helpful to have simple reminders throughout the day that would bring me back to philosophical awareness. When I put on my imperial purple, I would remember that the role was temporary and that my character was more important than my position. When I ate, I would recall the discipline of desire and appreciate what was present, rather than wanting something different. When I walked through the palace, I would practice memento mori and remember that all this grandeur was impermanent. The true test of integration comes during crisis situations. Anyone can apply philosophical principles when life is going smoothly, but wisdom reveals itself when circumstances become difficult. During the plague, military defeats, political opposition, and personal losses, I discovered whether my philosophical practice was genuine or merely theoretical. I'm grateful to say that the years of preparation served me well during these challenges. When news arrived of massive casualties from disease, I could grieve appropriately while maintaining the clear thinking necessary for effective response. When enemies achieved tactical victories against our forces, I could acknowledge setbacks while focusing on strategic adjustments rather than emotional reactions. But integration doesn't mean perfection. Even after years of practice, I still had moments of anger, fear, impatience, and doubt. The difference was that these emotions no longer controlled my behavior. I could feel frustrated with slow progress while continuing to work patiently toward goals. I could experience fear about uncertain outcomes while making brave decisions based on principle rather than anxiety. The most important insight about integration is that it transforms not just how you handle difficulties, but how you experience ordinary moments. When you live philosophically, routine activities become opportunities for wisdom. Conversations become chances to practice sympathia. Daily decisions become exercises in virtue. Even mundane tasks become meaningful when performed with conscious intention. I also learned that philosophical living affects everyone around you. When you respond to challenges with wisdom rather than reaction, others feel safer and more confident. When you treat people with consistent respect, regardless of their status or behavior, you inspire them to act better themselves. When you maintain equilibrium during crises, you become a source of stability for those who depend on you. Your philosophical practice becomes a gift, not just to yourself, but to your family, your colleagues, your community, and even strangers you encounter. Every moment you choose wisdom over reaction, compassion over judgment, or courage over fear, you add to the total amount of wisdom and peace in the world. The integration process never truly ends. There are always deeper levels of understanding to achieve, more subtle aspects of wisdom to develop, and new situations that test your philosophical resolve. But this ongoing development is part of the joy of philosophical living. You are constantly growing, constantly learning, constantly becoming more fully yourself. Start where you are, with what you have, in whatever circumstances currently surround you. You don't need perfect conditions or unlimited time to begin living philosophically. You need only the commitment to respond to this moment, whatever it contains, with the highest wisdom available to you. Begin today. Choose one interaction, one decision, one response to approach with conscious philosophical intention. Notice how this changes both the experience and the outcome. Then gradually expand this awareness to more areas of your life until philosophy becomes not something you do, but something you are. Remember, the goal is not to become a perfect sage, but to become more wise, more compassionate, and more free. With each passing day, every moment offers a new opportunity to practice, to grow, and to contribute to the flourishing of yourself and others. This is the true art of living, transforming ordinary existence into extraordinary meaning through the consistent application of timeless wisdom. Asterisk, asterisk, as I write these final words, knowing that my time in this world grows short, I want to leave you with the most important truth I have discovered. The principles I have shared with you are not merely my opinions or personal preferences. They are fundamental laws of human flourishing that have remained constant across centuries and will continue long after my name is forgotten. The techniques for conquering negative emotions that I developed during my reign were not new inventions, but rediscoveries of wisdom that philosophers and wise leaders have understood throughout history. The inner citadel, the discipline of perception, the dichotomy of control, these are not Roman innovations, but human birthrights that every person can claim and develop. What I want you to understand above all else is that you now possess something precious beyond measure, the knowledge of how to remain free regardless of external circumstances. No one can take this freedom from you unless you surrender it. No situation can destroy your peace unless you allow it. No person can control your responses unless you grant them that power. But with this knowledge comes responsibility. When you learn to master your emotions, you become capable of helping others master theirs. When you develop inner strength, you become a source of strength for those around you. When you achieve emotional freedom, you have an obligation to help others find their own liberation from the tyranny of reactive living. I have seen how one person's wisdom can transform an entire community. During the plague, when panic threatened to destroy social order, the calm response of a few thoughtful leaders helped maintain stability for thousands. During military crises, when fear could have led to devastating mistakes, the philosophical preparation of key commanders saved countless lives. Your emotional mastery will have ripple effects far beyond your immediate experience. The flame of wisdom that you now carry has been passed down through generations of seekers, thinkers, and practitioners. The Stoic philosophers who taught me learned from teachers who learned from other teachers, creating an unbroken chain of wisdom stretching back centuries. You are now part of this lineage, whether you realize it or not. Your responsibility is not just to apply these principles in your own life, but to pass them forward to others who need them. This doesn't require becoming a formal teacher or writing philosophical treatises. It simply means living in such a way that others can see the possibility of emotional freedom through your example. When people observe how you respond to criticism without defensiveness, how you face setbacks without despair, how you deal with difficult people without hatred, they begin to believe that such responses are possible for them as well. Your life becomes a demonstration of what human beings can achieve when they take conscious control of their inner experience. I think often about the young Marcus who first struggled with the overwhelming emotions of imperial responsibility. If I could speak to him now, I would tell him that every challenge he feared was actually an opportunity in disguise, that every person who opposed him was actually a teacher offering lessons in patience and understanding, that every setback was actually a chance to practice resilience and wisdom. I would tell him, and I tell you, that the path to emotional mastery is not about eliminating all difficult feelings, but about transforming your relationship to them. You will still experience anger, fear, sadness, and frustration, but these emotions will no longer control your behavior or determine your peace of mind. They will become messengers offering information rather than tyrants demanding obedience. The practices I have shared require dedication and patience. There will be days when you forget to apply them, moments when you react emotionally despite your best intentions, situations that seem to overwhelm your philosophical preparation. This is normal and expected. The path to wisdom is not a straight line, but a spiral. You will revisit the same challenges repeatedly, but each time from a higher level of understanding. What matters is not perfection, but progress. Each time you choose wisdom over reaction, you strengthen your capacity for future wise choices. Each time you respond with virtue despite others' poor behavior, you build character that will serve you in more challenging situations. Each time you maintain your peace despite external turmoil, you deepen your access to that peace in all circumstances. The world needs people who can remain centered during chaos, who can think clearly during crises, who can respond with wisdom when others are overwhelmed by emotion. The political upheavals, social conflicts, and personal challenges that you face in your time are not fundamentally different from those I faced in mine. Human nature remains constant across centuries, and so do the principles that allow human beings to flourish. Use what I have taught you not just for your own benefit, but in service of something larger than yourself. Whether you lead an empire or a family, manage a business or volunteer in your community, teach children or care for the elderly, you have opportunities every day to demonstrate that there is another way to live, a way based on wisdom rather than reaction, on principle rather than impulse, on love rather than fear. Remember that true strength is not the absence of challenges, but the presence of wisdom in facing them. True peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of inner stability regardless of external circumstances. True freedom is not the ability to control what happens to you, but the capacity to choose how you respond to whatever happens. I have given you tools that have been tested in the crucible of imperial responsibility, refined through years of philosophical practice, and proven effective in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. These are not theoretical concepts, but practical techniques that work when properly applied with patience and dedication. The flame I pass to you is not mine alone, it belongs to all humanity. It is the light of consciousness that allows human beings to transcend their immediate circumstances and live according to their highest values. Tend this flame carefully in your own life. Share its warmth with others who are struggling in darkness, and ensure that it continues burning long after your time on earth has ended. This is your legacy and your gift, the knowledge that no external force can disturb your inner peace unless you permit it, and the responsibility to help others discover this same unshakable freedom. Carry it forward with pride, apply it with dedication, and share it with love. The empire I ruled has long since faded into history, but the principles I have shared with you are eternal. They worked in ancient Rome, they work in your time, and they will work for generations yet to come. Use them well, and you will discover what I learned during my years of struggle and growth. That true happiness comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from mastering your responses to them. Go now, and live with the wisdom of emperors and the freedom of philosophers. The world is waiting for the gifts that only you can give.